Esquire, and today I'm joined by crime author Fiona Veitch Smith. Fiona is the author of the Poppy Denby Investigates novels, Golden Age style murder mysteries set in the 1920s. If you happen to be a fan of the Miss Fisher's Murders either book series or television series, you will love the Poppy Denby Investigates novels. The first book, The Jazz Files, was shortlisted for the Crime Writers Association Historical Dagger. Fiona is the Assistant Secretary of the Crime Writers Association and also the Deputy Editor of the CWA's Red Herrings magazine. So Fiona, welcome. It is great to have you here today, and I will go ahead and pass it off to you.
Thanks very much, Micah, and thank you very much for inviting me. Hello, everyone, wherever you are, whether you are in the US with a cup of coffee, I believe it's 10 in the morning on the East Coast there, or here in the afternoon with perhaps something a little bit stronger. Well, maybe not at 3 o'clock, but I'm very glad to see whoever's here, and I really hope that you enjoy my presentation. So let me see if I can share my screen, because I'm going to be talking through with some slides to just aid us in our discussion today. So here we go. Hopefully we won't lose anything. And there we go. Can I have a thumbs up that we can see that?
Fiona, you're perfect.
Excellent. Right. Let me go from there. Right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about writing historical crime fiction, the history and the mystery. Now, I'm not going to be talking today about how to write a crime novel, because you've already had lots of input on that, I should imagine, this week, and will continue to do so. I'm talking specifically about how to write a crime novel in a historical setting. We're going to be talking about 4 particular areas. We're going to talk about the period, the setting, the investigator, and the research. Now, when you're writing any kind of cross-genre piece, like a historical crime or a fantasy crime, you've got to consider 2 sets of genre conventions. Obviously, the crime story, how you construct a crime novel, but also how you would construct a historical novel or a fantasy novel or romance novel, whatever it is that you are crossing your crime with. So the history is just as important, really, as the mystery in the types of books that I write, and hopefully some of you are beginning to write as well. Now, if we were in the real world here, and we were in a hall somewhere, I would probably ask you who here is writing historical crime or is thinking about it, and I'd get you to put your hands up. So unfortunately, we can't do that now. So I'm going in a little bit blind, just assuming there'll be a good mix of people here, some who have already started on their journey and they're busy writing historical crime at the moment, or are just considering writing it, or really you've got nothing else to do at this time of day and you just thought you'd pop in anyway, and you might become inspired to write a historical crime. So hopefully you're one of those people, and hopefully I'll be able to present something for all of you. So the period, the setting, the investigator, and the research. Now, when I'm going to be talking through this, whoops, I jumped ahead there. I'm going to be looking at 3 different novels or 3 different series of novels. And I'm going to be using them as examples to pick up on the different aspects and how they differ from period to period. Again, if we were in a hall, I would say, stick your hand up if you've read the Medicus series by R. Downey, and I'll see who'd read it. So I'm assuming some of you have and some of you haven't. But the Medicus series is about a Roman doctor in 2nd century Britannia, in Britain, during the Roman occupation. Then we're going to be looking at by R.S. Downey, who is actually a friend of mine, Ruth Downey. And she was this particular book was a New York Times #1 bestseller when it first came out. She's now written an entire series with this Roman doctor detective. The next book we're going to be engaging with is The Name of the Rose, the classic by Umberto Eco. It was originally written in Italian in, I actually don't have the date, but it was late 1980s, 1986, 1987, somewhere around there. The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which was a standalone literary historical crime. No series came of it. Unfortunately, I would have absolutely loved to have followed through Brother William as a roaming monk detective wherever he went. And just very briefly, it's set in the 13th century. And it's about a monk called Brother William Baskerville, who goes to an abbey on business from the Pope, on secret business from the Pope. And when he's there, a series of murders take place. And he is invited, the abbot of that abbey, to investigate. And then the third set of books that we'll be looking at are my Poppy Denby Investigates series, which are set in the 1920s. And are about a female journalist in London, and who investigates crime on the side while also covering the art and entertainment beat for this London newspaper. So there we go, Medicus, The Name of the Rose, and The Jazz Files. And we're going to see how they contrast to one another and what we can learn from the different approaches of these three books. Right, so the period. You need to really choose your period carefully. If you're considering writing a historical, any historical really, not just a historical crime, you need to consider which period to set it in, because you've got the whole of history. You've got from history, what is a historical? We're often asked. We in the CWA, the Crime Writers Association at the moment, we take submissions for the historical crime Dagger. We take submissions from 50 years from today, 50 years back from today, but some people have 35 years, some people have varying numbers, but it's in the past 25, 35, 50 years plus going backwards. So you've got the whole of history to choose from. So how do you choose where to set your crime novel? So I would suggest there are a few things that you need to consider. First of all, I would ask myself, yourself, what are you interested in? Now, you're going to be taking a year, 2 years, 3 years to write your novel. You better make sure that it is a period that interests you, that excites you, that you feel comfortable in. Just a brief anecdote with this about my own novel, my own series, the Poppy Denby. When I was first considering writing it, I was visiting the grave of Emily Wilding Davison, who is a suffragette, and she is buried maybe 25 minutes up the road from where I live. And on the centenary of her death, she was the suffragette who ran onto the racecourse during the Epsom Derby and tried to throw a scarf over the King's horse to protest in favour of women's suffrage. And she was run down by the horse and died a few days later. So I was at her grave when I got the idea of having a suffragette detective, and I was going to set the series initially in the pre-war period, the late Edwardian period, 1912, 1913. And I thought, great idea. I actually pitched this to my publisher. My publisher loved the idea and said, go ahead with it. And I started writing it, and I struggled so much. I struggled to get into it. I liked the idea of the suffragette detective, but the actual period when I was doing the research, I was struggling to get excited about it. And the book just didn't make much progress. About 3 months later, I finally decided I was going to try and take the same concept and put it into another period. And at the time I was in my midlife crisis, I decided I wanted to start learning jazz clarinet. And at the time I was working on some 1920s tunes, and the whole 1920s music was in my mind. I was thinking 1920s, feeling 1920s, and I thought, well, why not set this book in the 1920s? So I transposed the story from the Edwardian times forward 10 years into the 1920s, and suddenly it came alive. And when I was 6 books later, I'm busy editing, working on the edits of the 6th book with my editor at the moment, and I'm not tired of it yet. So I'm interested in the period. It's something that feeds me. So why are you interested in your particular period? Is there some kind of connection for you? Is it a nostalgic connection? Quite a few people write historicals, more near historicals, 20th century historicals, because of memories from their youth or stories that their parents or their grandparents used to tell them. And those are all perfectly valid reasons to set your novel in a particular period if you feel you've got some kind of connection to it. It might be an intellectual connection. You might have just been reading something and thought, you know what, that sounds so interesting, so fascinating. I'd love to research that and follow that up intellectually. And I did that with the second book in the Poppy Denby series, which is about the white Russian diaspora. I was reading something about it and I thought, you know, that's so interesting. I'd love to follow that up. So there's an intellectual connection there. Or perhaps slightly more cynically, there's a commercial connection or interest for you, that you've seen that Roman books or Second World War books or Regency period books are doing particularly well at the moment. So you think you might try your hand at that. And it's something that you yourself enjoy reading in that particular period. That would be a reason, but make sure that there is some kind of connection between yourself and the material, or else it'll be quite soulless. Why might your readers be interested in this particular period? Same thing. What is going to be the connection for them? Will it be an emotional connection, a nostalgic connection, an intellectual connection? Sometimes actually it's because it's never been done before that people are interested in it. Imagine, top of my head, an Aztec detective before the European conquest of South America and South and Central America. Imagine that. So I certainly haven't read of an Aztec detective set in that period, but that alone may perk my attention and say, you know what, that would be absolutely brilliant. I'd love to read something like that. So sometimes it's the absolute wackiness of it, something that's never been done before that might interest people. On the other hand, it's because it's so popular and it's a tried and tested, again, like the Roman period we'll be looking at in Medicus in a moment. The Romans never seem to lose their appeal. But has it been overdone? Are people going to say, well, we've really had enough of Aztec detectives down the line somewhere, or the 1920s, or the Roman period, or the medieval period, which is the name of the rose? Has it been overdone? Or does it perhaps hold perennial interest? A way to research this is what books are currently being published and stocked by bookshops. Now, of course, you could do this online. You could go onto your favorite online or otherwise bookshop, including the one with the big A at the beginning. And you can see what's selling at the moment. But there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of books on there. I would suggest, as soon as you're able to, pandemic allowing, and you're wherever you are in the world, if bookshops are beginning to reopen again, I would actually go into the bookshops and see what is currently on the historical crime shelves. Now, historical crime actually in some bookshops is placed on the historical shelves and sometimes on the crime shelves. It's usually on the crime shelves, but do check out both. Very rarely, it's very rare that I've actually seen a historical crime shelf, dedicated shelf in a bookshop. So check out both shelves, but it is more likely to be on the crime shelf. But what is being stocked? See what's currently appealing to people and that booksellers think is going to be sold when you're considering what period to write for. So what gives your idea a fresh angle if you are doing something that's been done many times before? Consider that. How would something set in Roman times yet again be different? Because of course we've got the Didius Falco novel set in Roman times. So what makes Medicus different from that? Well, it's a Roman doctor, which is slightly different. It's not set in Rome itself, like the Didius Falco novels. It's set in Britain. So there is a slightly different, fresh angle on it. Another question you can ask, are there any contemporary resonances with the present day? I was on a panel, I don't know, a few weeks ago with a new author, actually, that has written something on it wasn't a crime novel, it was just a historical novel set during the Bubonic Plague, one of the Bubonic Plagues. And she said she was drawn to it because of what's been happening now. So she feels there's a contemporary resonance. It might be quite an obvious thing to have a pandemic at the moment, or to do something about the Spanish flu. And you may be careful doing that, because you actually may miss the boat on it. And you may get, by the time you've written your book, everyone's so sick and tired of the pandemic that they don't want to read anything else. But sometimes there are contemporary resonances with the present day. With my own Poppy Denby books, there's the fight for women's rights, unfortunately a century later, is still ongoing. So that is a contemporary resonance that is always going to keep, unfortunately, always going to keep my books relevant, because there's women struggling to get ahead in the work environment, women struggling against various societal norms and prohibitions, are something that actually gives contemporary resonance with the 1920s and is quite helpful in books that I write. Then you need to ask yourself, what's your base knowledge of it? If you know absolutely nothing about a period, it can be fascinating to learn as much as you can about it, but it's going to take a long time. So it is helpful in a way if you already do know a bit about the Aztecs or the Romans, or journalism in the 1920s, or abbeys in northern Italy. It is helpful if you already have some kind of base knowledge that you can build upon, but it's not absolutely essential, but it will help feed into this, and it might help you choose to place your book in one period rather than another, because you actually have some kind of experience and knowledge of it. And then, of course, there's access to research. Pardon me a moment. What research is available? Yes, we have the whole internet, which certainly when I first started writing 20 years ago, we didn't have. Well, it was just in its infancy then. But research then was going to libraries and getting books and going to visit places and museums and archives and things like that. Now we can do a lot of the research on the internet, but not all of it. But what access do you have? What research is available? Or is this going to be something that there is almost no information on, which is going to make, in some ways, your job easier and more difficult? It'll make it easier that you can actually make stuff up, and no one's going to say, well, it wasn't like that back in 742, you know. But no one's going to be able to say that if there isn't that much research on it in the first place. But that can be quite difficult, because then you can be, you'll be making up an entire world, and you might as well in some ways be doing a fantasy novel then, because you are a world building a completely new world yourself. So what research is available to you, and how can you access it? Something to consider. Research your period historically, but also with a crime story in mind. Consider, when you're doing your research, the politics, national and international politics. In the Name of the Rose, we have, at that period, we have two popes. There were two popes that had been anointed or appointed in the world, and the Catholic Church at the time and Christendom at that time was split between who supported which particular pope. And that is a backdrop for the Name of the Rose. So do your research into the national and into the international backdrop of your book. For the Roman book, obviously, it's Roman Britain, what was happening in Roman Britain at the time, in the 2nd century. What power structures were there? What was the religion like? Now, in some books, religion is not important if you're setting your book in certain periods. In other periods, it's very, very, very important. If you were setting something against the Inquisition, religion would be very, very important. If you're setting something in Roman times, religion is important as well, but a different kind of religion to what we know. So what gods were being worshipped? What was the religious structure of the time? The background of the major historical events. Was there a plague at the time? With the my Poppy Denby books, major historical events that has just happened is the First World War and the aftermath of that. Am I aware of that? Do I know what's happening, how it's going to inform my book? Communications. Now, with a crime novel, it's so important to understand the communications of the world that you are writing in. So if your detective, your investigator has to get information to or from someone, how would he or she do it? Poppy, my 1920s investigator, she can pick up the telephone because there are telephones at the time, but there's not that many of them around. And if she wants to call someone, does that person have a telephone or not? Does she have access to telegrams? How quickly will that information get to her and get to the person she needs to speak to? Back in Roman and medieval times, people are on muleback and on donkeyback, and they are sending messages slowly, plodding from place to place. If they're in a real hurry, they may be able to get a horse that can gallop all the way to get some kind of emergency information to and from. So communications, what was there? It'll has a big impact on information that your detective can get and can give. Transport falls into that as well. One of the great joys I have in writing the Poppy Denby books is knowing the bus routes of the various places that she goes to. And I try to go to wherever it is that she's mainly in London, but she does travel a bit as well. And to go down to London and to actually follow the bus route that Poppy Denby would go on to get from one part of the city to another. How long does it take Poppy to get from Fleet Street to Kensington? And is it just, you know, if she's rushing to get some kind to beat a criminal there, how long is it going to take her to get the bus from there to there, or the train from there to there, or for her best friend Delilah, who's a flapper and who has a car? How long would it take Delilah to get her from one place to another? Delilah, of course, doesn't drive particularly well, and there's usually accidents along the way. So what is the transport of the time? Again, back in the Roman times and medieval times, it was primarily horseback or carts. But we have the beginning of transportation in the 1920s. In your period, what's that transport? The social strata. Do we have working class people? Do we have middle class people? Noting that the middle class is quite a modern invention, actually. Do we have upper class people? Where does your detective come from? Are they a working class people, worker, a peasant, or are they more higher echelon? And what is the relationship between these social strata? And what is the legal and justice system in which your crime story is going to be set? And this is very important, because your crime will take place against a particular setting that may or may not bring the death penalty for whatever that crime is, depending on where you've set it, in what period and in what place. In The Name of the Rose, the medieval story, we have a religious justice system. We have inquisitors there who people are potentially could be burnt at the stake, depending on the crime. And that brings in the religion as well. Is this a demonically inspired crime or not? So what is the justice system and the legal system? You have the Medicus series set in Roman Britain, and the justice system there is a Roman justice system. But some of the stories take place within the native British population. And is there a difference between those justice systems? And what is the responsibility of the Romans and what is the responsibility of the Britons? All research that you would need to do. For me in the 1920s, it's pretty simple. We've got the London Metropolitan Police and we have a justice system, but it's important for me to know what was actually illegal then that isn't illegal now, and vice versa. What crimes would actually have a sentence and what wouldn't? What would those sentences be? What would be a death sentence or not? And that's what you need to figure out with your period. So 1920. 120s is the Medicus series. 1327 very specifically is Name of the Rose, and of course the Jazz Files is the 1920s. The second thing that you need to check is the setting. So we've got an infirmary, we've got an abbey, and we've got a newspaper. When you're doing your research, you need to be able to know that you can find what happens in a Roman infirmary. What medicines were used, what kind of operations were possible. And you'd be surprised, some of them are more advanced than you would have thought. research that. How can you research that? How can you find out about that? An abbey, what goes on in an abbey? How is an abbey run? What type of people are in an abbey? I always had the impression that they were quite dowdy, maybe just from seeing it on the television, but sort of dowdy places, not particularly attractive. When you read The Name of the Rose, the abbey there is a beautiful place with rich decorations, and I wouldn't have known that. Umberto Eco himself would have researched that. Who's in charge at the abbey? What's allowed? What isn't allowed? I read, again, The Name of the Rose, they had 50 monks, but they had 2.5 servants per monk. It was a very rich abbey. Do your research into that. A newspaper in the 1920s, what goes on in a newspaper in the 1920s? Now, I worked, before I became a full-time author, I worked as a journalist, and so I had an idea of how a newspaper operates. This was in the 1990s and the early 2000s. I worked on newspapers then in Cape Town and here in the UK as well. And how was a newspaper run? How did stories get from the typewriter of your reporter? And what was the process? Do your research into the specific setting. The specific setting, the place and the time. We've looked at that, the inner workings of the infirmary, of an abbey, of a newspaper, whatever your specific setting is. A brothel in Paris in 1742. What would happen, apart from the obvious, of course, at a brothel in Paris in 1742? But how might they have been run? Who was in charge? What did the place look like? What did it feel like? What was the culture of a brothel in Paris in 1742? The mise en scène, which means the props and the backdrop and the bits and pieces that your characters will interact with. The vehicles, what were the vehicles of the time? The food, the clothing, the art, the music, theatre, the literature. Now that's the stuff that I get sucked into in a rabbit hole way with my research. There's lots of vehicles and not so much food, although there is a lot of drinking of tea. Vehicles, clothing, art, music, theatre, literature, it's all in my Poppy Denby books. I also edit a series of books about a medieval physician, actually. And when I took over editing, because there'd been two previous editors, it's quite a long series. We're into the 13th book now at the moment. And I took over about 3 books ago. And there was so much food in it. I actually said to the author, I said, don't you think you've gone into just a bit too much detail here with all of the food? And he says, no, absolutely not. He says, that's what my readers love. They want the recipes, and he provides medieval recipes for all of the banquets that he has. And he has a detective in it, who's not called a detective, but he has an investigator in it. But his thing is food over and over and over and over again. And his readers absolutely love the food of the period. So what's the food of your period? What's the clothing of your period? The clothing in the 1920s is one of the things that a lot of my readers are attracted to. And I describe the outfits of the main characters, Poppy and her best friend Delilah, in great detail. And at the beginning of each new book, I go shopping for them. I get them in a couple of new outfits each, and I go into the collections of the leading designers of whatever year we're in. At the moment, we're up to 1925. And I'll go into Delilah will get something that is in 1925 because she's very wealthy and she's spot on the fashion. Poppy is poorer and gets hand-me-downs or would get something from last year's sale that was on sale. So I go into 1924 for her. What is the clothing of your particular period? Right, money. What did people pay for things? I'm currently writing something that is set in 1929, and I have someone inheriting a house in 1929 in the city where I live, Newcastle upon Tyne. So how much would this particular house in that period, how much was it worth? How much would my character actually inherited? What was the value of money in those days? What was the value of property? social mores and prohibitions, what was legal, what was illegal, and what will happen if your character challenges or transgresses these things. Homosexuality is obviously a big one. What was in The Name of the Rose, there are homosexual characters, and that contributes to one of the deaths. I won't give any spoilers, but how illegal was it? Well, they turned a bit of a blind eye to it in the Abbey. It didn't, in this particular Abbey, it didn't make that much difference, even though it was illegal at the time and frowned upon. It was, a blind eye was turned to it. Or would have this been an absolutely shocking thing that would have had them up before the authorities, the equivalent of the magistrate? What was homosexuality in those days? A birth out of wedlock, for instance, these things that if your character transgresses them, what would the penalty have been? The justice system. We've been over the justice system, and how might an investigator operate within this period? So lots to consider, the setting, the period, how to make it as authentic as possible, and to consider how your particular detective or investigator would operate. So looking at Rousseau here from Medicus, how does he operate as a detective in this period and in this setting? Well, he gets people who come into his infirmary who are either dying or dead. And he gets to examine the bodies, and he usually then discovers that something untoward has happened, or he meets a relative who suggests that something untoward has happened, and he then starts investigating. And because he has authority as a doctor, he is able to do these investigations. Brother William of Baskerville, now he is an investigator because he's actually an inquisitor. An inquisitor was on behalf of the church, and we have a terrible view of inquisitors from the Inquisition, but inquisitors weren't all burning people at the stake. They were really the investigators at the time, and Brother William is actually a good investigator, and you would find out who was guilty, if there was sufficient evidence for this person to be found guilty or not, and he would let people off if there wasn't sufficient evidence. So he is a good inquisitor, and he is able, with his authority, to investigate within that period. Poppy Denby, on the other hand, has very little authority. She becomes a journalist. She gets given a job on this tabloid newspaper, and in the course of her investigations into stories for the newspapers, she stumbles across murders, but she has no authority in herself to investigate. So how does she do this? Well, she has an editor who knows everybody, and he is able to get her in, and he gives her some kind of authority. But the very fact that she's a woman and she's always out of step and always pushing against the system is part of the tension of the book, but she has no authority like Gaius Rousseau and Brother William has. And that actually in some ways is the strength of the book. She's got to sneak around a lot more, because she can't just go in and say, hello, I am the doctor and I want information. And Brother William, who goes in, I'm the inquisitor and wants information, and is more able to get it. She has very little authority. So the investigator, what makes a good fictional character? How this can be applied to any kind of novel, really. But likability, I'm just going to go through it quickly because I'm sure you know a lot of this. The likability, relatability, the strengths and the weaknesses of the character. Is this a relatable human being or a real historical character? What I mean about that is that sometimes people try so hard to get all the details of the history right and what a character in that time would be like, that actually they become a caricature and they lose their humanity. You've got to try and put 21st century person, as it were. You've got to take them into your period. So I would focus more on a relatable human character than I would necessarily on how real the historical character is. Obviously, try to get both right. What agency does your character have? By agency, I mean the ability to take action. Rousseau and the monk are able to take action because they already have authority. Poppy Denby is not so able to take agency and to take action because she does not have inbuilt authority, and she has to actually take that herself. Relationship to authority, what is their relationship? Both Rousseau and the monk have people above them, and there's problems with that. Poppy has lots of people above her. And are they insiders or outsiders? Well, they're all outsiders actually in some way. And that usually makes a good fictional character, someone who's coming in from the outside and is able to bring an outsider's view into it. Is always useful because they bring the reader's viewpoint into the story. But there needs to be some insider information or access to that insider information. And how will your detective, your investigator, be able to get that? And again, we have the monk who he's an inquisitor and he knows lots of people and has lots of information. And we have the doctor who's able to access it because he knows he can get access to the families. I'm going to just pick up on a couple of things here. Is your character believable within the period? We've looked at that already. The profession, the education, the social status of your character, and personal skills to aid the investigation. Now, both Rousseau and the monk have scientific skills in a way. Scientific, obviously, that's a word that wouldn't have been used at the time. But they have abilities and skills and they're at the cutting edge of intellect at the time, and they're able to use those in their investigation. Poppy Denby is very good at getting to know people. She has interpersonal skills. She's very relatable and she makes friends easily and she gets people to trust her very easily. And that's a skill that she is able to bring to the investigation. But they all need Achilles' heels, and I've no idea why that's crossed out on the screen there. They do need Achilles' heels. A character that absolutely knows everything is no fun as a fictional character. So what is your character's Achilles' heel? With Rousseau, it's a British woman that he falls in love with, and she is his Achilles' heel and is always getting him into trouble. We have the monk's Achilles' heel actually is his pride. He's very proud. Poppy Denby's Achilles' heel is that she's too emotional, and that tends to get her into trouble over and over again. But they all have friends and they all have allies that they can draw on. Who are these friends and allies? They all have networking opportunities, and they all have enemies and nemesis. So your character, who are their friends and allies? What networking opportunities do they have? Who might their enemies and their nemesis be? And finally, research. There are three. I'm not going to tell you how to do research. You'll be very glad to know I do sessions on how to actually conduct historical research. But I just want to draw your attention to some broad principles within the research. So the historical context, we've looked at that. That's what I look at first, the backdrop, what's going on in the world out there. Then the specific historical story setting. We've got the abbey, we've got the infirmary, and we've got the newspaper in the case of our three examples. That's the next level of research, plus the fashion and the food and the transport and the money and what your characters are going to interact with. And then in the middle, we have the characters' inner world. What is it like to be a doctor in the 2nd century Britain, or a monk in 13th century Italy, or a young female journalist in 1920s London? And that's the most subjective part of the research. And it's something that you almost, that is something that needs to come from yourself as you inhabit your characters, how to make a real character, a real person in a real historical world. But it's subjective. You can get an idea by reading. I read lots of diaries and letters and things like that written in the 1920s to get a feeling of the voice of those people and the things that interest them. But ultimately, it's very subjective. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking. There's someone outside there. Right. So finally, you need to consider how much historical research you need to put in. And that really is a matter of taste. And like the books that I edited, where I felt there was too much food in the stories, to my taste, there was too much. And the author, on the other hand, absolutely loved it, and his readers loved it, but it's a matter of taste. My books, how much fashion, how much music, how much theatre do I put into that? My reviewers some of them tell me they absolutely love it. They read my books in order to be absorbed into all of that. Others say, actually, that just gets a bit annoying and I just want a little bit more of the mystery, please. And so it's a matter of taste between the reader and the author, and you need to find out what's right for you to try to find that balance. And sometimes it takes a while to get that balance. But what you need to consider always is that you need to serve your reader and the story, not show off your research. Just because you found out that there were 16 toilets on a particular cruise liner that sailed to New York, it does not mean that you actually have to mention there were 16 toilets. I did research on toilets of cruise liners going to New York, but is this going to serve your story or not? Or is it going to be just too much information? So don't feel that you've got to cram everything in. Just sprinkle it here and there. Lightly seasoned or richly detailed, according to taste, but according to what serves the story, and be prepared to leave stuff out. Balance of the history and the mystery. Again, that's a personal thing, but make sure there is enough mystery to keep the crime writers interested and enough history to feed those who love the period stuff. Ethics of changing history, gosh, we don't have time to go into that in 1 minute. But let's just say that if I do change something, I always fess up to it at the end. I have a historical afterword in all of my books in which I let people know if I have changed something slightly. Like I changed the date that Charlie Chaplin came to London in 1920 because I wanted my characters to meet him. I changed that. He wasn't actually there at that time. He was there at another time, but I fessed up to it. I would never change the dates of the First World War, for instance. There's things that, small things you can change, big things you shouldn't change. But if you do change anything, fess up to it at the end. Be careful with anachronisms. Whether or not something actually was there. Did brassiers have fasteners at the time, or did they have buckles, or did they have straps? What did they have at the time? Make sure as much as possible that you don't have something that's out of time. Telephones, what type of telephone did you have? Don't have anything that was in the period if you can help it, but always be prepared that you might and probably very likely will get some things wrong, because I always do. I try not to, I do the best I can, but I do often get some things wrong. Now that, in a very short space of time, is an overview of things to consider if you are writing a historical crime novel, or in fact just any kind of historical novel. And I hope you feel encouraged and challenged to try it yourself. Finally, just a slide with a few things that you could follow up with me if you'd like to. My books, there we have 6 of them at the moment. The funny thing at the end, Crystal Crypt, we haven't got a cover for it yet. I'm writing a new series which starts in 1929 and goes into the 1930s. It does have a name, but I'm not allowed to tell you what it is yet. My Poppy Denby books are all available in paperback and in large print and in audiobooks. So by all means, look them up, try them out if you'd like to. You can follow me. There's my Twitter handle, my author handle on Facebook, and my website. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have or not have, and I'll speak to you later on Facebook as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Fiona, that was a fantastic presentation. Everyone in the chat is talking about how much they enjoyed it. So thank you for all of this incredibly useful information. I'm sure everyone learned a ton. I do want to go over to our Q&A now. We actually do have a few different questions.
Mhm.
We'll start with a warm-up question that we got a couple of times that's talking about novels set in the 70s and 80s. Are those still considered historical?
No. No is the short answer, but I think it's wrong. Let's just say the market does not consider the 70s and the 80s. Pre-1970 at the moment is considered largely considered historical. What's the 70s and 80s are period novels, and they exactly the same principles apply, and I think that they should be, but the market does not consider them historicals. They would be considered period pieces.
So it's a little
If that
bit,
helps.
it's a difference in your personal philosophy versus what the publishing industry is thinking of.
Yes, and largely the publishing industry would say 1970 and prior to that would be considered historical. But write what you want to write. You know, if the 70s and 80s are what appeal to you, and the older we get, those do seem like a long time ago, don't they? You know, the 1970s is history for many of us, and certainly 1970s very soon will be historical, sorry to say. So if you're writing it at the moment, everything prior to 1971, actually, because we're in 2021. So carry on writing it. Certainly in the 70s and the 80s, it would be considered period still.
We actually have a really fascinating one on communication limitations, because I think today, with everything being instantly accessible, it can be very, very difficult for us to kind of put ourselves in the mindset of, having mule carts that it takes days to get a letter to someone. So how much information do you feel an author needs to communicate to put their readers in that right mindset, especially, I suppose, the further back in history they go?
Mm-hmm. You have to. In fact, that's one of the joys for me of writing historical fiction, is that everything has to slow down, and you actually have more time to develop the plot, because you can't just get a plot twist like that with a a telephone call suddenly coming in. If any of these characters want to find out some information, they would probably have to go to a library or have to interview someone in person. They or send a letter and wait for days for the answer to come back. So things do slow down, and it actually gives you more options in a way as a crime writer to construct your mystery and your plot, because it wouldn't be instantaneous information, and being cut off from communication completely is useful as well. In modern day things, you would have to always have your protagonist without their mobile phone for some reason in order to prevent them getting certain information. But consider that your protagonist in historical would never have had a mobile phone, so they're always cut off in some way, and you have to consider how they would access that information and how long it would take. But it can be to your benefit. Poppy went to New York in one of the books, in The Death Beat, and when she was in New York, needed to find out from the British Secret Service, as you do, and she sent a telegram to someone she knew in the British Secret Service on a Friday, but unfortunately she hadn't accounted for the time difference, and it only got there on a Saturday, and she had to wait then for the office to open on the Monday. And she was desperate for this information, but she couldn't get it. So we had 3 days or 2.5 days where she couldn't get the information she needed. So the communications, lack of them, or the constraints of them, actually have an impact on your plot development and what you can do as a crime writer in that period, if that helps.
Fascinating. So we actually have a couple of different questions on incorporating foreign languages in historical novels. So what is your opinion on how much of that should be incorporated? Let's say if you're taking, your novel is taking place in a non-English speaking country, let's say 19th century France, something like that. How much should you be incorporating of those foreign terms, things like that?
Well, These days, very few people would speak Latin and French as a second language, as they certainly as the literary classes of old days used to. One of my favorite authors is Dorothy L. Sayers, but she annoys me to hell by always using Latin and not translating it in there, and it just makes me feel stupid. But the literary classes she was writing to, the period, most of them would have known some Latin. They would have done it at school. So using foreign languages to people of another language who don't understand it, you're actually in danger of making your reader feel stupid because they don't understand. So you can certainly have dribs and drabs of it to give a flavor of the period and a flavor of the setting, but have instant translation. But if you were to actually write everything in French and English, it would double the size of your book, and it would also slow it down. So my advice would be just a touch, just a sprinkle here and a sprinkle there, to give the sense of it. And if you do, translate it as well, because if readers will either feel stupid and annoyed, or it will slow them down because they'll have to go look up the German word or the French word or the Japanese word, whatever it is, and it'll take them out of the story. So anything that takes your reader out of the story. So if you're going to have a little bit to give it a flavor of the place and the period and the language, a small little bit and with almost instant translation. And there's no reason why you can't just translate directly into text. You can have that, or you can have someone who speaks a different language and actually answer answer in English in response to it. It is way through it, but I would say that less is better with that.
Wonderful. So we have time for probably one or two more questions. And guys, remember, Fiona will be popping over to our Crime Writers Week group to answer some more questions for about another half hour. So if you didn't get your question answered here, please pop over into the group. But we're getting a lot of questions on how to research laws, especially because there are some that are maybe a little bit esoteric to our, 2021 minds. I think in the chat, there was one mentioned about a law against charming crops in which they were transported from one field to another. So how would you go about kind of finding out a little bit about maybe some of the crazy laws of the time that
Absolutely. Well, your local university history department is your friend. That historians and archivists and museum people are usually so generous with their time, because they're just so pleased that anyone is even vaguely interested in something they've been working on for the last 30 years. So I would try to make, if you are working on a particular period, find a university that there is someone doing research into that period, and they are usually very, very helpful in pointing you in the right direction. They're usually delighted that there's someone who's showing any kind of interest. The internet as well, there is lots of stuff on the internet. If you were to plug in 14th century laws, there's bound to be stuff on the internet on that. But yes, there are some very, very obscure laws, but be careful that just because there was a law at the time, you need to understand or know whether or not it was enforced, because there's lots of laws that were on the statute books that were, and still now even, are not enforced. And it's one of those things that it was just a hangover from a previous period. And the charming crops, would someone just turn a blind, someone perhaps like Brother William in The Name of the Rose, who is a bit more sophisticated, would he sort of turn a blind eye to that, or would he apply the letter of the law in that particular situation and the penalty of that against the charming of the crops, or would he take a slightly more sophisticated and compassionate view on it? So yes, understand the law, but understand whether it really was applied or not in that period, or it could just be ignored.
Fascinating. I'm sure we're familiar with having laws today that, are still on the books somewhere, but nobody enforces them, fortunately.
Exactly. You shouldn't keep a goat in your back garden or whatever it is, or you can have 3.5 chickens, but not but not 5.
And then I guess just to wrap up, how far in advance are you kind of running this research? Is this something that you do all of this before your first draft? How do you kind of set up that timeline so you're not overwhelmed?
Right. Well, that brings me to the point where I mentioned it's useful if you already have some base knowledge, because the more base knowledge you have of a period, just something maybe you've just been reading books about and it's something that fascinates you. The more base knowledge you have, the shorter the period. But with me personally, I researched for 3 months the main thrust of my period, and then I start writing. During those 3 months, I make notes about what various story points that could fit in, and how Poppy, my character, how Poppy might fit into that and how it might impact upon her as I'm doing research into the period. Then I start writing after 3 months, and then I continue to research as I go along, but only when I come across something that I don't know. I need to fill in a detail, fill in a detail, fill in a detail. But let's just say that the broad structure is already set at my 3-month period. And then I write for 9 months. Well, I write for 8 months, and then the last month is a polishing of it. But I've know authors who've written for research for 10 years before they actually started writing. But when I've got a contract, I have to write to contract. I have to write a book a year. But even if you don't have that, you need to be strict with yourself and don't allow yourself to go down too many rabbit holes. Give yourself, I would say 3 months is a perfectly adequate period to get the gist of your research. Stop yourself from continuing doing the research and actually start writing, because you may find that a lot of the research that you did actually isn't relevant, and rather come to something on a need-to-know basis. You get to a point in your story where you actually need to know whether or not opium was illegal at that period, but you don't know that, and so you would stop and you would go and quickly have a look into it, but it doesn't stop the flow of the story. So yes, my advice would be, because it works for me, 3 months and then write.
Okay, so that 3 months is kind of almost like an immersion period for you, and then from there it's just kind of filling in the blanks as you go along.
Yes, and sometimes there's more than others, but yeah. And the longer I go in my period, it's six books in now, I feel a lot more confident to start, because I know I've got six books worth of research behind me already of the period, which I'm able to draw on. I feel a lot more confident to just start the story. But certainly when I first started out and I had to try and come to terms with the period, I needed to do more research just to give me some more confidence.
Okay, well, Fiona, this was a fantastic session. I'm sure everyone is looking forward to popping into the Facebook group to talk to you for a few minutes. Guys, we have posted some links in the chat. Again, they are going to be our links to our 50% off of Pro Writing Aid University, 40% off of Pro Writing Aid, and then also the links to join our Crime Writers Week Facebook group and our networking event that happens at 5 p.m. Eastern today. And finally, of course, we also have a link to Fiona's site. So if you want to find out more about her work and buy her books, definitely pop over there and take a look. But thank you all for attending. Fiona, thank you so much for a wonderful session. And we will see you guys at our next session today.
You're most welcome. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.